The bus hummed with quiet chatter and the occasional clinking of keys as passengers settled into their seats. Among them was a teenage girl, clutching her school bag tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Beside her sat a man, presumably her father, whose booming voice broke through the calm. His words were harsh, dismissive, and painfully directed at the girl. "You'll never amount to anything if you keep acting like this," he scoffed, his tone dripping with disdain. "You think life's going to hand you success? Dream on." The girl didn't respond, her silence speaking volumes. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one intervened. In the back of the bus, a man in plain clothes shifted in his seat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of presence that commanded respect. His sharp eyes flicked between the father and daughter. To anyone else, he might have seemed like just another commuter, but this man wasn't ordinary. He was a Navy SEAL, trained to observe, assess, and act. And right now, his instincts told him something wasn't right. The father continued, his voice growing louder. "Do you know how embarrassing it is to have a daughter like you? You're a failure." The girl winced but didn't say a word. She seemed trapped, her small frame sinking further into the seat as if she could disappear. The Navy SEAL clenched his jaw, his mind racing. This wasn't just a father scolding his child. It felt deeper, more damaging. He thought of his own family, of the values he'd learned in the military about protecting those who couldn't defend themselves. A surge of determination coursed through him. The bus stopped briefly, letting a few passengers off, but the tension in the air remained. The SEAL knew he couldn't let this continue, but he also understood the importance of timing. Acting impulsively could escalate the situation, and he needed to be strategic. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the father. What happens next is a moment that will redefine courage and compassion. A moment where a stranger decides to step in and make a difference. What will the Navy SEAL do to help this young girl? And how will the father react when he's confronted? Stay tuned for the full story. This is more than just an encounter on a bus. It's a lesson in standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. The Navy SEAL watched as the father continued his relentless tirade. Each word seemed to hit harder than the last, chipping away at the girl's spirit. She sat frozen, her fingers gripping the strap of her bag like it was the only thing tethering her to the moment. Her downcast eyes avoided everyone around her, as though she feared meeting their gaze would somehow make the humiliation worse. The man's tone shifted to mocking, his words laced with sarcasm. "What's next? Another excuse about how you're trying your best? Life doesn't reward weakness, you know." He leaned back, shaking his head in frustration. The girl flinched slightly but remained silent, her face a mixture of shame and quiet endurance. The SEAL's jaw tightened as he observed the dynamic between them. Something about the father's behavior went beyond frustration. This wasn't a bad day or a heated moment. It felt calculated, almost cruel. The SEAL, trained to read people under pressure, couldn't ignore the gut feeling that told him this was more than it appeared. He glanced around the bus, noting how the other passengers avoided looking directly at the pair. It was the kind of silence born out of discomfort, a collective decision to pretend nothing was wrong. His thoughts drifted back to his own childhood, to a time when he'd watched someone he cared about endure similar treatment. He remembered the helplessness, the anger, and the regret that came from staying silent. Now, as a Navy SEAL, he carried a responsibility that extended beyond the battlefield. It wasn't just about protecting his country. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter where he was. The bus hit a bump, jostling everyone in their seats. The father, undeterred, shifted his focus to the girl's appearance. "And look at you. Who's going to take you seriously looking like that? You don't even try." His words were sharp, cutting through the muffled hum of the engine. The girl finally moved, pulling her hoodie tighter around her as if to shield herself. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The SEAL noticed the slight trembling of her hands, a subtle sign that she was holding back tears. He weighed his options carefully. Intervening directly could embarrass her further, and he didn't want to add to her pain. But ignoring the situation wasn't an option either. He needed a way to step in without escalating the tension. His training had taught him that sometimes the best action wasn't the loudest, it was the most deliberate. The bus slowed at another stop, and a few more passengers boarded, filling the remaining seats. The father shifted, seemingly preparing to unleash another round of criticism. The SEAL took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't the kind of mission he'd trained for, but it was no less important. As the father's voice rose again, the SEAL made his move, subtle, calculated, and with one goal in mind: to protect the girl without making her feel more exposed. What he did next would change everything. The Navy SEAL stood up slowly, steadying himself against the slight sway of the bus. His movement was calm, almost unnoticeable, but it carried purpose. He walked down the aisle, pausing near the father and daughter's seat. The father glanced up briefly, his expression shifting from annoyance to mild curiosity before he turned back to his daughter, ready to continue his verbal barrage. The SEAL didn't sit down, though. Instead, he cleared his throat, drawing attention without raising his voice. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I couldn't help but overhear." The father raised an eyebrow, his expression hardening. The girl's head shot up, her wide eyes darting between the two men. She looked nervous, as if the stranger's involvement might make things worse. "What's it to you?" the father snapped, leaning back in his seat as if to assert dominance. The SEAL didn't flinch. He had faced down far more intimidating figures than this man, but he kept his expression neutral. "I just thought I'd offer a different perspective," the SEAL said, folding his arms casually. His voice was steady, his gaze unwavering. "You see, I've met a lot of people in my line of work. Some of the strongest, most resilient ones weren't born with it. It was forged in them, often because someone believed in them when no one else did." The father scoffed, a bitter smile spreading across his face. "You don't know her," he said dismissively. "You don't know how lazy she is, how she never listens. She's never going to make it if she keeps this up." The SEAL nodded slightly, as though considering the man's words. "Maybe," he said, his voice calm. "But I've also seen what happens when people are pushed too hard, criticized too much. It doesn't make them stronger, it makes them doubt themselves. It makes them give up before they even get the chance to try." The father's face twitched, his irritation visible. The other passengers were now paying attention, their earlier avoidance giving way to curiosity. The girl, still clutching her bag, seemed torn between fear and hope, as if she couldn't decide whether this stranger was making things better or worse. The SEAL shifted his gaze to her, his voice softening. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, glancing at her father, who gave a dismissive wave as if the question didn't matter. Finally, she whispered, "Emma." "Emma," the SEAL repeated, his tone warm. "That's a strong name. You know, I've worked with people who face tougher challenges than most can imagine. But the ones who succeed aren't always the loudest or the fastest. They're the ones who keep going, even when it's hard. Do you do that, Emma? Do you keep trying?" Emma blinked, her eyes filling with unshed tears. She nodded hesitantly, her voice barely audible. "I try." The father shifted uncomfortably, his confidence beginning to waver. The SEAL turned back to him, his expression hardening slightly. "Maybe what Emma needs isn't to be torn down but built up. Sometimes the strongest thing a parent can do is show their kid they believe in them." The father opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. The bus jolted slightly as it approached the next stop, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. The SEAL's calm gaze never left the man, his presence commanding respect without a single harsh word. The tension was palpable, the moment hanging in the air like a fragile thread. What the father would do next, how Emma would respond, and whether the SEAL's intervention would change anything, all of it remained uncertain. The father's face flushed red, a mix of anger and embarrassment. He looked around the bus, suddenly aware of the eyes on him. Passengers who had been pretending not to notice were now openly watching, their curiosity and quiet judgment filling the air. The tension was thick, every second feeling heavier than the last. Emma shifted nervously in her seat, her hands trembling as she held onto her bag. She couldn't bring herself to look at anyone, especially not her father. Her heart pounded, torn between wanting to disappear and the smallest flicker of hope that this stranger might actually change something. The father finally broke the silence, his voice low but sharp. "You don't know anything about us," he hissed, leaning closer to the SEAL. "You think you can just step in and play hero? This is my family, my business. Stay out of it." The seal didn't back down. His calm demeanor remained, but there was a steel edge to his voice now. "You're right," he said. "I don't know your family, but I know what it looks like when someone is being crushed under the weight of words like yours, and I can't sit by and watch it happen." The father's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He looked as if he might explode, but the seal held his ground, his unwavering gaze locked on the man. The bus driver, sensing the growing tension, glanced nervously in the rearview mirror but said nothing, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Emma's eyes darted between the two men, fear flickering across her face. She wanted to speak, to say something that might diffuse the situation, but the words caught in her throat. Her father's anger was something she had learned to avoid, and she wasn't sure if this confrontation would make things better or worse when they got off the bus. The seal, sensing the precariousness of the moment, softened his tone just slightly. "Look," he said, "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here because I see someone who's struggling, and I know what it feels like to need someone to step in. Maybe you don't see it, but Emma does, and whether you realize it or not, she's listening to every word you say, every single day." The father's expression faltered, a flicker of something, guilt, recognition, crossing his face. For a split second, he looked away, as if the seal's words had struck a chord he didn't want to acknowledge, but the anger returned quickly, like a shield. "You think this is easy?" he snapped, his voice rising. "You think I don't care? I'm trying to make her strong. The world isn't kind, and she needs to toughen up." The seal shook his head slowly. "Strength doesn't come from being broken down," he said. "It comes from knowing someone's in your corner, someone who believes in you, even when you don't believe in yourself." The bus lurched to another stop, the screech of the brakes cutting through the heavy silence. A few passengers shuffled off, glancing back at the scene unfolding but saying nothing. Emma sat frozen, her eyes wide and wet with unshed tears. Her father's breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to hold on to his anger. The seal stayed quiet for a moment, letting his words sink in. The tension was unbearable, the air charged with the possibility of what might happen next. The father looked at Emma, his face hard but his eyes conflicted. Whatever he was feeling, it was clear he was battling something deeper than what anyone on that bus could see. As the doors hissed shut and the bus rolled forward again, the seal stayed standing, his presence a silent reminder that someone was watching, someone cared. But what the father would do next, whether he would lash out, back down, or finally see the damage his words were causing, remained an unanswered question. The moment teetered on the edge, the resolution just out of reach. The bus hummed as it picked up speed, the heavy tension pressing down on everyone inside. The father sat back stiffly, his jaw tight, but his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly as they rested on his knees. Emma glanced at him from the corner of her eye, uncertainty etched across her face. She had seen his anger before, sharp, loud, and unrelenting, but this was different. He wasn't yelling now. Instead, he looked unsettled, like someone who had been forced to confront something he didn't want to face. The seal remained standing, his calm presence an unspoken challenge. He hadn't said another word, but his silence was deliberate, giving the father space to react. It was a strategy, one honed in countless tense situations. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was wait. But before anyone could speak again, the bus driver suddenly pulled over. The brakes screeched, and the vehicle came to a jerking halt. Passengers exchanged puzzled looks as the driver grabbed his radio and murmured something inaudible. "What's going on?" someone near the front asked, their voice cutting through the low murmur. The driver stood up, addressing the passengers. "Everyone, stay seated. There's been an incident up ahead. Traffic's at a standstill. We're going to be here for a bit." A ripple of frustration swept through the bus. People pulled out their phones, checking maps or messaging whoever might be waiting for them. The seal, however, was focused on something else. Through the window, he caught sight of flashing lights up ahead, a police car and an ambulance parked haphazardly across the intersection. His instincts sharpened, his gaze narrowing as he scanned the scene. Emma shifted uncomfortably, pulling her hoodie tighter. The sudden stop seemed to magnify the tension between her and her father, trapping them in a confined space with no easy escape. Her father leaned forward, rubbing his hands together as though trying to shake off his unease. I just want what's best for her, he muttered suddenly, his voice low and directed more at himself than anyone else. The words hung in the air, surprising even Emma. She looked at him, her lips parting as if she wanted to respond, but no sound came out. The seal took a step closer, his expression softening just enough to draw the father's attention. Sometimes, he said, his voice steady, what's best isn't about what you say, it's about what you do. Kids don't need perfection. They need someone who shows up for them. Before the father could respond, a commotion near the front of the bus pulled everyone's attention. A man wearing a worn jacket stepped aboard, his movements hurried. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously. He glanced around, his demeanor jittery and out of place. Hey, the driver called out, his tone wary. What are you doing? This bus isn't going anywhere for a while. The man ignored him, his gaze scanning the rows of passengers. The seal's muscles tensed instinctively, his training kicking in. Something about the man's behavior set off alarm bells. Emma noticed it too, her grip tightening on her bag as her father shifted uncomfortably beside her. The man reached into his pocket, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. The seal's eyes locked onto him, his body ready to spring into action. Whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to be simple, and it wasn't going to be safe. The stakes had just risen, and the conflict on this bus was far from over. The man's hand moved slowly as he pulled something from his pocket. The seal's sharp eyes tracked every motion, his body coiled like a spring, ready to act. A breathless hush fell over the bus as the passengers watched, tension thick in the air. Finally, the man revealed a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it with shaky hands and held it up, his voice cracking as he spoke. Please, I need help, he said, his words uneven, desperate. My wife, she's hurt. They won't let me through the barricade, and I don't know what to do. The seal's instincts adjusted instantly, his readiness for combat shifting to a need for action of a different kind. He stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. What happened to your wife? He asked, his piercing gaze locking onto the man. The man stammered, struggling to explain. There was an accident. She's in the car up ahead, but the paramedics can't get her out yet. They said the road's too dangerous to bring more people in, and I don't know if she's going to make it. The seal nodded, his mind racing. He turned to the bus driver. How far are we from the scene? Just a block or two, the driver replied, gesturing to the lights ahead. Without hesitation, the seal looked back at the man. Let's go. I'll see what I can do. The man blinked in disbelief but nodded quickly, his hope reignited. As they moved toward the front of the bus, Emma watched, her eyes wide with awe. Her father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, visibly grappling with everything that had unfolded. The seal glanced back once more, his gaze landing on Emma. Stay strong, he said softly, his words carrying a weight that felt personal. Emma gave a small nod, her shoulders squaring slightly as if his belief in her had given her strength. The seal and the man exited the bus, disappearing into the chaos ahead. Inside, the passengers exchanged murmurs, their tension slowly ebbing but their curiosity growing. Emma sat quietly, her thoughts racing. She glanced at her father, who was staring out the window, his expression unreadable. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Then, the bus door swung open, and the seal stepped back inside, his calm demeanor intact despite the strain visible in his eyes. Behind him, the man followed, tears streaming down his face. She's stable, the seal announced, addressing the bus. The paramedics have her now. She's going to be okay. A ripple of relief spread through the bus, passengers nodding and murmuring their approval. The man turned to the seal, his voice breaking as he said, Thank you. I don't know how I can ever repay you. The seal shook his head. You don't need to. Just be there for her. That's what matters. As the man stepped off the bus to rejoin his wife, the seal returned to his seat. But before he could sit, Emma's father spoke up, his voice hesitant. I think I owe my daughter an apology. The seal paused, his gaze softening as he nodded. Emma's father turned to her, his expression a mixture of regret and determination. Emma, I'm sorry. I've been too hard on you. I didn't know how else to prepare you for the world. But that doesn't make it right. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from hurt. She nodded, her voice trembling. Thank you, Dad. The bus resumed its journey, the hum of the engine filling the space. As they drove, the seal leaned back in his seat, his mission complete. But as he glanced out the window, a small smile crossed his face. The real victory, he knew, wasn't in what he'd done, it was in what had changed. The bus moved steadily through the city, the tension that had gripped it earlier now replaced with a quiet sense of relief. Passengers began to settle back into their seats, some glancing at Emma and her father, others casting grateful looks at the seal. The chaos had calmed, but the echoes of what had happened lingered, leaving everyone thoughtful. Emma sat with her head leaning against the window, her thoughts racing. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. Her father's apology had been unexpected, and though it didn't erase the years of harsh words, it felt like a step forward. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. He looked different somehow, less rigid, more human. Maybe he was beginning to see things differently, just as she was. Her father shifted in his seat, breaking the silence. "I've been so focused on making sure you'd be strong that I forgot you already are," he said quietly, his voice filled with an honesty Emma hadn't heard before. I want you to know I'm proud of you." Emma's chest tightened, her emotions welling up. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she simply nodded, blinking back tears. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as someone who needed fixing, but as someone who was enough. The seal, sitting a few rows away, watched the exchange with a small smile. He didn't need to say anything more. His presence had already shifted something profound. He'd seen this kind of transformation before, a spark that could grow into something bigger if nurtured. As the bus pulled into a stop near Emma and her father's neighborhood, the two stood to leave. Emma hesitated for a moment, then turned to the seal. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying both gratitude and admiration. "You didn't have to step in, but you did. I'll never forget it." He gave her a nod, his expression kind. "Just remember," he said, "strength isn't about not falling, it's about getting back up, and you've got that in you." Emma smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest as she stepped off the bus with her father. They walked the short distance home in silence, the air between them no longer heavy with unspoken resentment. Instead, it felt lighter, filled with the possibility of something new. Back on the bus, the seal leaned back in his seat, his mission complete. He didn't need recognition or thanks. Seeing the shift in Emma and her father was enough. As the bus continued on its route, he gazed out the window, his thoughts already moving on. For Emma and her father, the day marked a turning point, a chance to rebuild what had been fractured for so long. And for the seal, it was just another moment of doing what he could to make the world a little better, one small action at a time.